Before we go any further, I need to address something. There's a reason I don't talk about politics on my channel because I have a job that prohibits me from doing so. And the truth is, I don't actually want to make a living off of YouTube. I actually really like my job. And also, I don't feel adequately informed enough to comment on American politics, a foreign country to whom I have no connection to or understanding of. Why do I specify American when the work I'm going to be talking about is set in Britain? Well, that's precisely what we're here to talk about. So I feel it important to impress upon you that I am not analysing the merits of the politics themselves. I'm taking this from a purely narrative perspective. So if, for example, at some point in this video it sounds like I'm defending, say, anarchism, I'm not. I'm just defending Moore and Lloyd's vision for their character and the message of their work. What really grinds my gears in the modern cultural conversation is the growing feeling that Western culture is being treated as one homogenous culture. I'm not saying that's what people believe it is, but it's what it's increasingly being treated as. And while I have mostly stayed out of the culture wars that continue to plague our online existence, not that I don't have my opinions, they'll just stay between me and mine, I am going to fire the first shot in my own little cultural battle, and that is Americans' adaptations of British works, in particular British comic book works. This is not specific to comics, but it's what we're mostly going to be talking about here. And one more thing before we go any further, I want to be perfectly clear about what this argument isn't. This is not a claim that British comics or storytelling is inherently superior to Americans, or a dismissal of American storytelling sensibilities. Americans are more than capable of producing work that is dark, cynical, and morally complex. Stories where there is no clear division between good and evil. No comforting resolution, no moral high ground. Likewise, there are moments where a more openly optimistic or uplifting American outlook produces something genuinely great. For example, outside of comics, Mary Poppins is an obvious example of warmth, sincerity, and emotional clarity done exceptionally well. And that's not even touching upon the entire horror genre. The issue I'm interested in isn't quality but perspective. When British works are adapted through an American cultural lens, they're often reshaped to fit narrative instincts that prioritize clarity, heroism, and emotional reassurance. In this process, a distinctly British mode of cynicism, irony, and discomfort, one that's often suspicious of power, uneasy with heroism, and deeply aware of complicity, gets smoothed away. What frustrates me more than anything is not that this happens, but that it so frequently goes unnoticed, as if nothing meaningful has been lost because we treat Western culture as one large interchangeable viewpoint. My argument is simply that cultural differences matter, and that when they are erased, we lose something specific, deliberate, and worth paying attention to. Now, this may sound harsh on the adapters because I did go into writing this with a much more militant point of view, no doubt stemming from my having to deal with the incompetence of the boys' TV show and people's insistence that it's better written than the comic, without apparently having read it. But I am too lazy, and as we just established, too employed to do a complete rewrite, so please keep this more measured tone in mind when we're going through my complaints. The measured tone will be returning when we reach our conclusion. I want to start with an adaptation that was very well thought of upon its release, the author's opinion notwithstanding, is still well thought of today, set its story in Britain with British characters, and still managed to Americanize it to the point where all meaning was lost. I'm talking about V for Vendetta. I'm not here to critique V for Vendetta as a movie itself, as I think as a movie itself it's pretty good. My main problem is how it could have so badly missed the point, or even if it tried to get the point to begin with. I will definitely give it props for being an American production that actually sets its story in its original location. But I get the feeling that if the main character's visage was not literally Guy Fawkes, I suspect they would have tried. I'm going to be honest and say that while the birth of this video came from several things, a lot of it stemmed from this one moment in this guy's YouTube video.
Well, let's be honest, most of us first encountered Guy Fawkes in the "wait, who is this dude again" section of world history class, right before we completely forgot about him until this comic came along.
What? What? Remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. We have an entire day called Guy Fawkes Night. It's literally marked in our calendars. The bloody phoenix in Harry Potter is named Fawkes. There's an entire nursery rhyme about it.
Remember the 5th of November.
I mean, Jesus Christ. I've been told to remember the 5th of November practically since I knew what the months of the year were.
We must be very careful to keep everyone safe on Bonfire Night. So, every 5th of November, remember these 4 rules.
So obviously there are people in the comments who are calling him out on this, and he's like, oh, that's my American showing. My good man, your American has been showing throughout this entire video. See what I mean about very specifically America and Britain treating each other's cultures as if they're interchangeable? Oh, I, an American, have never heard anybody talk about this historical figure from a country thousands of miles away who died long before my nation was even born, so that means nobody talks about him because we're basically the same.
Known worldwide for my steely-eyed look. You're famous because of Valamore's 3rd best book.
Jesus Christ, this is why subreddits called r/shit Americans say exist. Have you ever seen that subreddit? It's fucking wild. Practically every example you give in your video centers around American history, America's relationship to fascism, and American anxieties that were contemporary to the time the movies were made and now. That is the theme of the video. But here's the thing. Besides that silly comment about Guy Fawkes, I don't blame this guy one bit because that is what the movie is about. Besides the coat of paint they've given it, there's very little British about it. And we cannot get in to V for Vendetta's adaptation without talking about one of its creators, Alan Moore. Because I know a lot of fans of this movie may be tempted to dismiss the author's displeasure with this work, considering there are literally no adaptations of his work he has been in the least bit pleased by.
The thing that I'm dead set against is basically its adaptation. It's the fact that Hollywood can only recycle things that have already been done.
To the point where he refuses to accept any money for the use of such works, giving all of his share of his V loyalties to his writing partner David Lloyd. A lot of people, myself included, are a little more generous with changes made in adaptations because I think it's important to balance loyalty to the original work and see that it stands on its own. And even then, sometimes works that change things whole cloth, ignore the creator, or outright flip the adaptation on its head to create the opposite message can sometimes yield good results. However, I'm here to make the point that V for Vendetta, far from being loyal, far from being a deliberately different entity intent on making its own point, it is an adaptation that fails because I don't think it's trying to do the latter. If it's doing it very clumsily, and I think it's unaware of the fact that it's doing neither. So for those who haven't seen the film, the gist is that in response to various disasters and crises, Britain is now in the grip of a fascist government with all the iconography and real-life restrictions on freedoms that come with such a thing. A young woman named Evie falls in with a vigilante in a Guy Fawkes mask who goes by V. She gets caught up in V's various plans to bring down said fascist government. The government falls, V dies, and the story ends, or in the comics case, begins. So, not only does the film adhere to the basic plot of the comic, and without getting too far into it, some smaller plot and character elements, but if you're just looking for a straightforward timeline of what happens in the comic, you could say this is reasonably accurate. However, loyal in wording does not mean loyal in spirit. There are a few minor changes to plot and major changes to characters that make this a very, very different story to the original if you even pay the slightest bit of attention about what it's trying to say to you. And I think the biggest plot element I can point to is the destruction of the Houses of Parliament, which was the climactic act of V's rebellion in the film, but happened at the very beginning of the story in the original. I'll get to what the changing of this placing means in a minute, but to me, this encompasses just all that's wrong with this adaptation. And for those of you who watch my boys content, will know how frustrated I am with the show's treatment of the government as little more than complicit victims that have to be saved from the evil megacorporations or shown the correct way, the bad apples picked, so to speak. V has a similar problem with its politics, and it all comes back to how American this movie is. It loses all of its bite thanks to one thing. The original V for Vendetta comic was an indictment of fascism, certainly, but in a quieter and, in my opinion, much more clever way. Moore and Lloyd show you throughout the comic how useless the government is and how tenuous its grip on power is, and all it will take to come toppling down is for one domino to fall. This difference cannot be displayed better than putting the two scenes where V is lining up the dominoes side by side. In the film, it's more an illustration of what V has been doing throughout the entire movie. He has been putting these dominoes in place so that when he's ready, he can topple them over and the whole thing will come crumbling down. In the comic, however, the dominoes are V's illustration of what fascism already is, what that fascist government already is without his intervention. It is, by its nature, a line of dominoes. All V or anyone else needs to do is to topple one over for it to all come crumbling down. It shows the weakness of fascism and strong-arm governing by showing you that the dominoes that only need a push to come crashing down are just the natural manifestations of the system of fascism. It shows that these systems inevitably crumble under the weight of their own flaws. Fascism is not something that needs a great, insanely clever, superhuman person to bring it down. It is a weak way of ruling people that will fall under its own power, and at a certain point only needs the most minor of pushes. And that push will be the natural consequence of the system that they've set up. V didn't set up this system, they did. The film, on the other hand, seems to show how, until V starts to rattle their chain, efficient and insanely difficult to topple this system is. Now, I know why they did this. Typical storytelling convention, in particular superhero storytelling convention, dictates that a good way to create a great hero is to create a great villain. The more impressive your villain is, the more impressive your hero is for having taken them down. And this is where I think the problem arises with it being Americans that make these adaptations. It comes from, as I said, a revolutionary spirit, and also the monopolization of the comic books industry by the superhero genre, which is what Garth Ennis was talking about, but all in good time. Every single country has its historical truths along with its legends and its shared zeitgeist. I am only looking at this through the lens of a foreigner, so feel free to correct me, but I always got the feeling that the American zeitgeist was a revolutionary spirit. Freedom is naturally a part of that, but it's different than the kind of freedom you would see in, say, a Scottish cultural zeitgeist, which is more a primitive kind of freedom that every man is owed by right, whereas I see American as more a modern idea of freedom born of Enlightenment ideas and, of course, a revolutionary war. Now, why am I getting into any of that? It's because, again, I want to be clear that my frustration does not come from a different point of view being taken by a foreign mindset. That I actually find very exciting. How stories from one culture's mindset can be taken and recontextualized by people who have a very different way of looking at things. My irritation comes from not fully treating these works as separate in and of themselves. I'm also saddened by the fact that because the movie had a more simplistic message about the power of the people and a more feel-good aspect, that it overshadows the original work rather than standing side by side with it. When it came to writing this part, I hummed and hawed over how to do it, but when it comes to talking about what's wrong with this adaptation, I felt it was best to just let Moore do the talking. So I'm going to go through the main reasons he has cited for his disdain for this film. Apologies to anyone currently watching from Northampton. Part 1. An American Liberal Fantasy. It's been turned into a Bush-era parable by people too timid to set a political satire in their own country. It's a thwarted, frustrated, and perhaps largely impotent American liberal fantasy of someone with American liberal values standing up against a state run by neoconservatives. There are a few things to support Moore's point here. The biggest one is, as I said, the positioning of the destruction of the Houses of Parliament and the movie's climactic march and rising up of the people. This was, in the movie, the thematic act of destroying the fascist government through the power of the people woken up by an exceptional leader, parentheses, hero. Additionally, a big thing in the comic is that the fascist leader is killed by a character called Rose Almond, who, due to losing her abusive secret policeman husband, was forced into more and more desperate circumstances until she, having nothing to lose, pulled the trigger on the man at the top of the system that had caused her so much pain. This is something V could never have planned for, but one thing he definitely knew was that fascism will eventually, by its nature, push people too far and is a system that cannot sustain itself, which was once again replaced by the triumphant rising up of the people. So yes, Bush-era parable and American liberal fantasy indeed. A smaller example being the character of Finch, who in the comic is a washed-up, disenchanted cog in a dying regime. His journey is not one of changing and becoming better, it's one of understanding and bleak acceptance. In the movie, he is the standard good guy on the wrong side, who eventually has a come to Jesus moment. See how he mumbles, "England prevails?" under his breath, and he's also dressed in a kind of dishevelled fashion, whereas all the characters around him are very smart looking, so that's how we know he's different. We'll get to the good guys versus bad guys concept soon. But the good guy on the wrong side is wildly inappropriate here. Again, I get it, but there is a big difference between conscripted German soldiers and the Gestapo.
I've been a party member for 27 years.
Talk about defanging the fascists, eh? Speaking of which, part 2, the defanging of fascism and the silencing of anarchy. There wasn't a mention of anarchy as far as I could see. The fascism has been completely defanged. I mean, I think that any reference to racial purity has been excised, whereas, actually, fascists are quite big on racial purity. In my humblest apologies. V in the comics is quite explicitly an anarchist. He wants to burn the whole thing down, because he wants to burn the whole thing down. The adapters decided to remove the themes of anarchy in order to fit into their American Bush-era liberal fantasy. They also decided to remove any references to racial purity, as fear of what happened outside of Britain and it potentially infecting the country was what allowed the government to be voted in by the people. In the movie, it was semi-replaced by a government conspiracy, and the tragedy that allowed them to gain power was orchestrated by the party themselves. Again, very clear Bush-era anxieties here. As for how they treat fascism, again, I've already said about how they kind of went out of their way to make the government a somewhat functioning scary bad guy kind of entity in order to make their superhero character look more badass by comparison. The problem with doing that, and I think I've mentioned this in my complaints about The Boys, is that you unintentionally venerate them. You unintentionally somewhat legitimize them. And I'm not saying there aren't interesting questions that could have been asked about characters who think fascism works.
The Empire improves every system it touches, judged by any metric. Safety, prosperity, trade, opportunity, peace. Is the world more peaceful since the revolution?
But it's kind of weird for an anti-fascist movie to essentially say that fascism works, and the only reason that it wouldn't is because a great leader would rally the people against it, rather than there being something fundamentally weak about the system itself. Fascists are not great masterminds. They are opportunistic bottom feeders who see tragedy, strife, and crisis and use that to seize unearned power. And the very reason this movie does not impress me, and the reason I don't think it's a great anti-fascist movie, is very much the way it treats fascism. Not to mention the audience's relationship to it. Again, we can illustrate the differences in approaches to this by putting two very similar scenes side by side. In the comic, when V takes over the TV station, he very deliberately points at not only the people in the comic watching the TV station, but the audience reading the comic itself, and says, "You did this. You voted this administration into power. This is your fault. Fucking fix it."
And where once you had the freedom to object, to think and speak as you saw fit, you now have censors and systems of surveillance. And truth be told, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror. I know why you did it. I know you were afraid. Who wouldn't be? War, terror, disease. There were a myriad of problems which conspired to corrupt your reason and rob you of your common sense.
I know you were scared. I know you were scared, but it's time to stop being scared and rise up. Because I said, in the movie, it's not bottom feeders taking advantage of humanity's worst fears and impulses. It is people being legitimately tricked by a conspiracy and then being too cowed by the authoritarian regime to do anything about it. To anyone who loves this movie, I want to genuinely ask you, do you see how much this framing lets the audience off the hook? And again, I am staying completely politically neutral here. I know in today's current political landscape, there's going to be so many people drawing comparisons between things that are happening today. I swear I'm not doing that. But even if you look at historical examples, that's not how this works. It is leaders failing, crises happening, people reacting to those crises and looking for someone to blame for their own misfortune and misery, and someone coming along and says, this particular person, this particular group of people are who is to blame, and I am the one who is going to sort it out for you. Replace that by an innocent populace being tricked by a great conspiracy and then cowed by an authoritarian regime, just completely removes any and all agency that the comic gave to its readers. Necessary agency, in my opinion, when it comes to discussing fascism. And don't get me wrong, I am a genuine advocate for just letting people enjoy things. If you just want a good guy beats the bad guy movie, then absolutely, like, more power to you. That you do not deserve to have someone say you're wrong for that. But if you are here in the YouTube video essay space critiquing these movies, you have exited that space of, I'm just here for entertainment. I am putting this question to people who genuinely analyze this movie and say that it's a good representation of fascism. Part 3. Reframing a ruthless, unfeeling killer as a hero. I actually don't think it's right to kill people, so I made it very, very morally ambiguous, and the central question is this guy right, or is he mad? In the film, there's no such doubt. V is a ruthless killer, but that is made to look pretty cool. So yeah, taking a morally ambiguous character and reframing your script to frame him as indisputably right. The script explicitly supports V, even recontextualizing his torture of Evie as genuinely necessary. V is kind of a psychopath in the comics. He's a psychopath with a point, but one whom you're meant to see in a very different light than how the movie tries to portray him, which is just straightforward heroism. And I really want to touch on the torture of Evie because, again, in the comics, we are always asking a question. What is he doing? We are not expected to think of the torture of Evie as necessary. He does it because he's training her to take his place once he dies. He knows that once the system comes toppling down, there's going to be much more work that needs to be done. That is Evie's function in his plan. It just seems so much less motivated in the movie. He says he loves her, but he puts her through this horrific, mind-breaking thing in order to free her of her fear, apparently. And the movie explicitly frames this as having been for the best.
That would have scared me before, but I suppose I should thank you.
I mean, just look at the framing here. And the torture shall set you free. Jesus Christ. It's also clear in the comic that you're meant to question V significantly. I don't just mean question if his ends justify his means. I mean question him. His ideology, his methods, his motivations, his means, and the ends he brings about. Nothing brought this home more to me than the issue in the comic where we're introduced to Leader Susan, who is talking to what we later learn to be the AI he is using to run the country and is also in love with. Then we cut to V having a conversation with the Statue of Justice, and there is a reason these two scenes are so similar, that the cadence of the conversations they are having with essentially themselves, and even the way both these men see themselves, are being mirrored. At first you think V is just being his same eccentric self that we saw in his interactions with Evie, but then the conversation gets personal. This is the first indication we get that there may be something wrong about this guy. Whereas in the movie, well, he's just a bit of a quirky girl.
My fat metal friend.
The torture he endured gave him a mental breakdown. It didn't give him a great will to help the good people and trust for humanity to prevail. Torture doesn't make people, it breaks people. Another consequence of the classic superheroic framing. Within that framing, victims either ascend their victimhood and become heroes or descend and become villains. Real people are far more complicated. The movie does this kind of icky framing that, even though there's no explicit sexual assault in this movie, it reminds me of that cliche of victims of sexual assault having their experiences make them stronger.
Had you broken in? Had you broken in rough?
Without Littlefinger and Ramsay and the rest, I would have stayed a little bird all my life.
The film doesn't frame the torture as right, per se. However, it does frame it as essential. It's framed as how Evie ascends. It does say it was bad. It even says that V is mad or maybe a monster, but the movie's framing of V is the exact opposite.
And that's what this is all about. You're getting back at them for what they did to her.
You can't just say the opposite of what you're framing and claim it as nuance. Look, we said that it might have been a bad idea to torture Evie for basically no reason, because you can't torture fear out of people. So that means that we did actually question the character and the narrative. No, you definitely didn't. No, you framed the character and the narrative as explicitly right. A couple of lines whispered in the opposite direction does not constitute nuance. I think it is incredibly poetic how they bring up the Count of Monte Cristo, a famously long, slow burn tale of the creeping, dismantling power of revenge, how it changes the people seeking it, how it brings innocence into the fray, how it will ultimately never give you satisfaction, but at the same time can also be a tool on the path to acceptance, being watered down to a strong yet resilient hero beating the bad guy and delivering justice upon his wrongdoers.
It was not my sword, Mondego, but your past that disarmed you. Take him secretly to his garden entrance, as by this time his front door is surely besieged by reporters from every newspaper, and perhaps the police. I'm accustomed to fighting as the underdog.
The thing that I'm dead set against is basically its adaptation. It's the fact that Hollywood can only recycle things that have already been done or adapt things from media where they weren't intended as films.
Yeah, it's a poignant comparison, but not in the way the movie thinks it is. We also get a lot of this oversimplification and removal of nuance when V kills Delia, a doctor at the concentration camp where V was held. And this is when it became clear to me that it's not just V's character they defanged in order to make a more likable protagonist, but they seem to have removed so many of the complexities regarding human nature in general, not to mention the biting critique of it. In the comic, Delia talks about the Milgram experiment. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what the Milgram experiment is, it was a post-war experiment where ordinary people were put in front of what they were told was a shock machine and told to press the button. On the other side of the screen, there was someone they couldn't see who was an actor who was making pained sounds. And the experiment was to test how far people would go if an authority figure told them to do something. Now, this experiment can be highly critiqued, its methodology, its ethics, everything. But it is a very chilling and poignant example of what humans are willing to do if an authority figure tells them to do it. There were many people who refused to do it. There were people who quit early in, but there were people who kept pressing the button when the actor started begging them to stop. And most chillingly, there were even people who continued after he had stopped screaming altogether. Delia's conclusion from that is that human beings are a weak, evil little species, something that V also thinks. He doesn't feel sorry for her because she has a heart and ended up on the wrong side due to her boundless scientific curiosity leading her astray. Oh boy, will we get to that! He feels sorry for her because he sees her as an insect in a swarm. This is another thing I find so disappointing about the movie because it's so unchallenging and again lets the audience off the hook. Delia's confession ties so much into the theme of fascism and how it does not force its way in, it's allowed to rise with the consent and even support of the people. It's like the movie and the comic are in a tug of war for if humanity is ultimately good or ultimately bad.
He hates me!
Yet he caught me. Man is good.
He was horny, so he dropped him. Man is evil.
And here's the clincher. What I think a lot of people do not talk about enough. In fact, I don't think I've seen anybody talk about this, which personally I find wild. In the movie, instead of the Milgram experiment, Delia references Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer represents scientific curiosity colliding with catastrophic consequences, the ethical ambiguity of ends justifying the means, and a creator haunted by the destruction and pain those ends ultimately are.
How about because this is the most important thing to ever happen in the history of the world?
World War II would be over. Our boys would come home.
You are the man who gave them the power to destroy themselves. And the world is not prepared.
Oppenheimer's work was targeted against Nazi Germany, and his guilt is tied to the scale of the consequences, not the ideological alignment. So you've compared what is essentially this universe's Joseph Mengele to Oppenheimer. Yes, Oppenheimer is a moral quandary, there is no doubt about that. But these two things are not the same. Talk about defanging the fucking fascists. I honestly just can't tell you how sick I find this. I'm a fan of the band Sabaton, and they have a song called Father, which tackles very, very similar themes, but it's about chemical warfare in the First World War. I wish I could play you the song, but copyright, so let's have a look at Father and the themes it covers, and how it asks a very similar moral question to that we find in the life and work of Oppenheimer. And long ago in Eastern Prussia, young men with great ambitions rise. So who can tell me, who can say for sure which one will win the Nobel Prize? It was a golden age for science, the Kaiser Reich would hold the key, and as the conflict came and tensions rose, the manifest of the 93. This kind of science begins completely disconnected from the humanity that it will eventually effect. But if a military application can be found, it will be used whether the person who found it approves of it or not. Where will this lead? What's coming next from your inventions? We wonder where does it end? Who can foresee, see what will be? And this is the question because we don't know. Inventions may be used to make lives better, to save lives, to improve food production, cleanse water, explore space. Or they may be used to deliberately or even sinisterly passively cause pain and destruction and want. Haber-Bosch, the Great Alliance, wears the contradiction. Fed the world by ways of science, sinner or a saint. Perversions of ideals of science, lost words of alienated wife. And in the trenches on the Western Front, unknowing soldiers pay the price. And on the battlefield they're dying, and on the fields the crops are grown. So who can tell us what is right or wrong, maths or morality alone? Please listen to that song if any of those themes take your fancy. It's amazing. Do not look to this movie for those themes. Please, God, don't. What I mean by reciting some of that to you is that the theme of scientific curiosity and our genuine lack of knowledge and often control over what we make, going to good or ill, is a genuinely important theme in just looking at humanity. But much like what I said about Finch, it is wildly inappropriate here.
Is it meaningless to apologize?
Never.
As I said, this is essentially this universe's Joseph Mengele, who, by the way, did not find anything useful in his heinous experiments, but even if he did, it would not be the same as Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer was able to change more than a course of a war. Change the entire course of human history. Is it wrong to hold on to that kind of hope?
I've not come for what you hoped to do. I've come for what you did.
Scientists who create things that then go on to harm people is not the same as a concentration camp doctor literally fucking harming people. Making this comparison just makes it seem like she just happened to find herself torturing people in a concentration camp because she was scientifically curious. She was just trying to create something and didn't realize the extent of the damage until it was too late. Oops! Having those humans literally suffering in front of you, at your hands, sometimes physically at your hands. And the movie frames it as scientific curiosity, the consequences of which got out of control of its original creator.
Oppenheimer was able to change more than a course of a war. Change the entire course of human history. Is it wrong to hold on to that kind of hope?
I think I might actually hate this movie. And yet they don't really mention anarchism at all. I think the only reference it gets is when people are getting riled up and ready to take down the dictatorship, and one mention of anarchy is a guy using his V mask to rob a random store. So yeah, you can see how much these writers respect Moore's work in that scene alone.
Anarchy in the UK!
If you want my opinion, I read the comic as anarchism is a good tool to take down dictatorships, but isn't really good at building anything afterwards. That is why the comic is so open-ended with what on earth will follow V's success and death. What will the country do? What will Evie do? To replace that with a knife-wielding noble freedom fighter who rises up the people against an authoritarian government, the authority of which wasn't freely and mindfully handed over to them, is Toothless. So I hope you understand what I mean by this film being excessively American. If you pay even the slightest bit of attention to it, it's about as British as Dick Van Dyke. It removes the fundamental message of anarchism versus fascism. It turns a morally questionable character whom the audience is invited to question into a standard classical superhero. And most importantly, it utterly defangs and legitimizes fascism. The choices this film makes is just so baffling. I can't put it better than Moore did. It is an American Bush-era parable and liberal American fantasy. And I question why this is. As I said in the beginning, there are so many great things by American writers that tackle these themes and question them. Why, when it comes to British works, does the nuance get stripped away? Maybe Moore was right.
The thing that I'm dead set against is basically its adaptation. It's the fact that Hollywood can only recycle things that have already been done or adapt things from media where they weren't intended as films.
As a rule, I don't think so. But in this case, and quite a few others I can think of, most definitely.